Pedro, would you like to start?
Can you tell that I'm eager to participate in this discussion? Let me start by thanking you, Donna, for your leadership and for inviting me to be part of this dialogue. Education is not my field of expertise. However, that's what I've been doing for the last few years, so I have strong, uneducated opinions that I'm very willing to share with everybody with the purpose of having an open discussion. Having said that, let me frame again the discussion that we're about to have in the context of our learning and teaching model. It's about the teaching and learning model. Now, however, this document and what is contained in this document is not written in stone and is not forever said. The purpose 2 years ago of having this document was to actually document and to capture the different practices that we had across campus. Remember that we knew that many people were doing many different things that had not been documented. Secondly, to try to start introducing some common language that should evolve through the pass of time, right? And third, to open a dialogue and a debate on how our teaching and learning model should evolve through the pass of time. So actually, in purpose, we said that this document should have a 2-year-long lifespan and that it needed to be reviewed, again, with the purposes not to having another 25-page long document, but actually to host this type of debates and dialogues. So I'm very, very happy that these discussions are happening. Now, specifically about learning outcomes. The model as crafted, when we described it, we identified 11 main components. Learning outcomes is one of those 11 components. However, not all learning outcomes were created equally. They should not all weight the same or mean the same. As a matter of fact, if you allow me, I think that we could actually probably split them into groups. The ones which are about the what's, the fundamental components of the philosophy behind the I'm trying to use the proper word, which is not pedagogy, which is andragogy, but I haven't been able to pronounce it properly, so you know what I'm talking about. Motto. And there are others which are really more about the tactics of how to teach, right? Learning outcomes is one of the pillars of the philosophical underpinning of the model. Now, learning outcomes, the way we use them, there's really nothing innovative about them. Many other universities and many other institutions actually use learning outcomes. What is innovative on our end is how we use them. Now, there are many challenges on how we use them. I believe that the greatest challenge for us, as you saw from the video, is not really on introducing learning outcomes. The challenge for us is to do that with greater clarity and with greater consistency. Am I making sense with what I'm saying? The challenge is not learning outcomes by themselves, is having a conversation that would allow us to have greater clarity and consistency. Learning outcomes are part of this philosophy, which is called social constructivism, which assumes that learning is a social process that can be properly managed and designed to maximize the amount of learning and teaching that happens in the classroom. I do believe that this philosophical approach is very different from that older perspective that thought that learning just happens in an environment when people get together. I think that the reason for this is the assumption that if you manage the process and you design it well, you will actually guarantee the learning happens and you will maximize that amount of learning that will happen according to the different learning styles of the students that you have in the classroom. So it's not just about having people there, it's about managing the learning process strategically. Back to this document. And I was told that I was only given 5 minutes, so I will go into the main points. Learning outcomes is a dialogue that needs to continue to happen on campus, and through my role in the faculty and my role in curriculum committee, I've seen six or seven items that could be worth having a conversation on how to move the learning outcome understanding forward. So what I'm going to do is to highlight them or identify them and define us whether we want to play with them or not, right? Here's the first one. We are not using consistent language. You already pointed that one out, Donna. In different areas, we use different words to describe similar or different things. Learning outcomes, learning domains, competencies. I think we do need to work on having a common understanding of what words mean and what is it that we really try to communicate by them. Secondly, this document and the fundamental model it suggested that the choice of learning outcomes to be included as part of the design of a program should actually be consulted with advisory councils before we actually choose them. I'm not sure we're doing that I think we are choosing them with very little external consultation. I'm not saying we're doing it wrong. I'm saying we need to revise that point, right? The third one is, should the university have some core learning outcomes to be used relatively consistently across programs to be enriched by other flexible program-specific learning outcomes or not? We haven't had that conversation yet. Apparently, many programs, if not most programs across the university, use critical thinking, problem solving, working with others, pretty much in all programs, but we have not had the conversation on whether they should be core learning outcomes or not. Finally, fourth on this list is how fixed should those learning outcomes be? And I see different approaches across campus here. Some people believing with good arguments that we should agree on a fixed language and interpretation and we should all consistently use them. And another different perspective that says, no, we should have a general understanding of what we mean by them, but we should also allow us to be more flexible on the way we apply them or use them across different programs. I think both approaches have merits. I think they're worth a conversation. And finally, there is a lack of inconsistency on a few of the specific learning outcomes that we use that I would invite us to start considering and maybe debating about. Here's the first one, knowledge. Some programs use knowledge as a specific learning outcome. Some other programs don't use knowledge as a specific learning outcome. They leave that as an implied learning objective of the program. Should subject discipline knowledge be a learning outcome or not? I think we should debate that. Secondly, assessment. We should not go any further into the selection of the pedagogical tactics or textbooks or even profile of instructor and student without having a much thorough discussion on what do we mean by assessment. And following the process that Donna prescribed to us, shared with us a minute ago, it is fundamental to social constructivism that you start thinking about the learning objectives first, and then you have a discussion about assessment before you choose the actual content of the session. I think we're not really doing that yet. And finally, thank you for that. Let me remind us that the purpose of this whole thing is to make explicit what was implicit before. The purpose of learning outcomes is to force us to identify what is it that we want students to learn, what is it that we want to teach, so that we build a strategy in order for that to happen. Forcing us to craft in writing, many different ways, what we usually used to leave it in an implicit form, assuming that everybody would understand it because it was implicit and practiced through traditional ways of teaching. So I'm going to stop there and thanking you again for the opportunity and pass it to my colleagues now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael.
Well, thank you, Pedro. I think I was listed originally, I don't know if this is written down anywhere, as a fence sitter, non-committal. I think that may have changed a little bit. I went back over some documents produced by other academics, and I won't try to pronounce his last name. Frank Ferretti, UK, and talking about learning outcomes as corrosive or destructive. And I thought I'd outline some of his main arguments because they fit very much with what we've been doing as far as discussions in curriculum committee, and we've been redrafting a lot of our curriculum in the School of Humanitarian Studies, particularly in the graduate programs. So I'll just sort of outline some of those points, and then I'll put a counterpoint at the end about where learning outcomes might be considered okay. So the first one is that, and this one I don't know if we can disagree or agree on this, but we look at learning outcomes as an interference of the voyage of intellectual curiosity and experimentation. And that results, that relationship between professors and students is what brings about that curiosity and what helps to feed what we'll call that Socratic dialogue, and from it comes their learning experience. The argument is that creativity cannot be predetermined, and with this one-way dynamic with learning outcomes, we've basically negated collaboration. So the Socratic teaching method, as we've come to know it, is impotent. And so from this perspective, the basis of the university is challenged. And we are now making the conclusion, or we're getting close to arguing that we've become a vocational institute and we're producing widgets. On the other hand, professors also need that stimulation that comes from that open dialogue and Socratic thinking and messaging, because that's where we get our inspiration to keep going. Number two, learning outcomes create a climate where professors are not necessarily prepared to deal with uncertainty. With the prescripted type of pedagogy and approach to learning, we aren't ready for surprises. We may be ready for the aha moments, but we may not be ready for that tangent which could lead us in a new direction. This could be considered a fallacious attempt to bring certainty in the learning, which really isn't possible. If we bring certainty into learning, then we've created a dead-end street. So standardization of pedagogy tries to bypass the indeterminacy of knowledge and understanding. Third, it devalues the art of teaching, particularly based on experience. Academics no longer have to think for themselves. Cookie-cutter academics are teaching. And fourth, it creates a culture of cynicism and irresponsibility, because now the fundamental goal of holding academics accountable fosters non-responsibility. And by that, we're talking about we don't any longer have to be responsible for being creative, being responsible for pushing the margins or the envelope of knowledge. We now just have to make sure the outcomes are covered. So the upshot here, what I'm taking out of this is, while learning outcomes are authored by academics, the language and the narrative are scripted by agencies. The values and organizational ideals are external to academicians, and the open-ended dynamic between professor and student becomes reduced to platitudes that will never be realized. In other words, we don't really know that we're having knowledge at the end of this or not. This is the gift of utilitarianism to us. What matters is that the learning outcomes are achieved, not necessarily whether learning has occurred. So this is, on the one hand, I guess, a bureaucratic or anti-bureaucratic argument, and it's a management tool used for convenience, and is used to discipline academics, used to keep us in line. So it's pretending to be a pedagogical paradigm when in fact it's not. It's just another check in the box to make sure that it's done. And what I take out of that is no more free thought. That's the real downside of learning outcomes, I think, from my perspective. And Frank's. But so what possible good can come of learning outcomes, especially considering the fact that learning outcomes are derived from program outcomes? And I'm distinguishing the two because of my role on curriculum committee. We do a lot of course evaluation. We don't get as many programs across our desks, but those two should be linked. So, are our programs then challengeable? Are they also not just widgets on the assembly line? So are program outcomes equally corrosive? That could be a question for another day, I think. But learning outcomes have a place in academia, at least as far as I can tell, in that they, as one of the people on that video said, they give us something to hang our hat on, especially in new programs and new areas and new disciplines. And Royal Roads has a habit of sort of charting new territory and developing programs where other programs haven't been in place before. And one of those programs in our school, disaster emergency management, of one of those. So in essence, it gives us a place to start. It orients us, gives us the tools to be able to develop curriculum and to get started. In cases where new courses and programs and even professors are involved, they provide a starting point from which curriculum can grow. The key in my mind here is that we do not become shackled to learning outcomes. I think that's the important part for me. And that they are not, as many critics argue, a means to an end or an ends to themselves. And I think I'll leave it there. That's a dark enough spot to be in.
Thank you very much, Michael. Michael Party?
Thanks. Thank you for those great, excellent summaries. I'm going to actually deviate a little bit from what I was going to say. I'm going to pick up on some of the conversation that I hear here to continue the dialogue that we're having, just to sort of build some connections. And I'll try and tie in some of my original thoughts towards the end. As I listen to this conversation, it really occurs to me that this conversation is really centered around two polarities. And at one end of this continuum, we have this desire for stability, predictability, the idea that we can recreate the same kinds of outcomes again and again and again. That's the manager's answer to education, right? And at the other end of this polarity, we have this desire for creativity and innovation, for newness. And that would be the leader's end of this polarity, if you want to think of it in those terms. And we are constantly struggling to balance these two things because, of course, we sit inside an institution. We have a vessel. There is structure. We do have a need for some predictability. We need to be able to actually put stuff up on a website to get students to come and tell them something about what they're going to learn. At the same time, we obviously don't want to stifle the ability of any of the faculty to bring in new research and new ideas to teach in innovative ways. And so I see this tension inside this system. And I think especially in a system like a university where it's highly decentralized, there is very little accountability, very little collaboration and control. Once I walk into the classroom and close the door, basically no one knows what I'm doing and no one's sort of looking over my shoulder. Even if I crave that kind of support and contribution and collaboration in the classroom, it's very hard to achieve. We're all busy doing different things. Here at Royal Roads, a lot of us work on contract, so we're not here from year to year necessarily, or from program to program, or we teach in multiple programs. So there are many things that push against some of the checks and balances that we might have. In historical context, inquiry-based learning would happen inside a guild through a system of apprenticeship and journeyman and mastership, right? We don't use that system in the academic setting. We have a more formal and more structured process for learning. I'm not saying it's good, but much of the critique, which I happen to agree with, and even in the end, I'm a supporter of outcomes. But I think that there is a danger in outcomes. There is a danger that we fall into this dark pit, right, of unoriginality, right? Universities are supposed to be a place where people are able to discover new things. We come here not to confirm our biases, but to have our biases challenged. This is the purpose of higher education, I think, to see the world in new ways, right, to come to new understandings. And so I'm going to start pulling a couple of these pieces together. What do we do with outcomes? For me, outcomes have an independent life. I'm going to have this idea in my head about hybrid leadership. When we think about leadership in the classroom, I would be prepared to argue that leadership emerges from the interactions with the students, between the teachers and the students, right? That in fact the students lead in that sense if you're really kind of engaged in the learning process. But we still need stars to navigate by. And the purpose of outcomes is the stars, right? They give us some direction and focus for where we want to go. What kind of ship we use, whether we sail at day or at night, who's on deck and who's below and who's doing all those things is left up to me as an instructor. But we need the leadership of the outcomes because the outcomes have a quasi-independent existence in time and space. They exist beyond me. And so they are things that others can navigate by and judge my own, and I can judge my own practices by as well. And so I think that they have some value, but that we need to always be critical in the same way that we use our critical skills in the classroom. We need to be critical of those outcomes. And as Pedro said, this is not a Bible, right? This is a living and breathing document that we should be discussing, that we should be arguing about. And therein, I think, lies the value in outcomes. It gives us something to argue about. I'm very fond of the story of Stone Soup. Does everybody know this story? A traveler and his son are wandering through a rural part of the world, and they're quite hungry, and they come to a village, but there's been a famine in the area, and the villagers are really reluctant to share food with the travelers. And so the traveler lights a fire and puts a pot on the fire and puts some water in it, and he says, "Well, I'm just going to make some stone soup." So don't worry about me, and he puts a couple stones in it, and then, the first villager comes over and says, oh, what are you making? I said, well, I'm making some stone soup. Well, what is stone soup? Well, it's really delicious, and, oh, well, can I taste it? Yeah, but it'll be really improved if we added a couple of carrots. Well, I got some carrots, and this goes on, and suddenly we have this great pot of soup, right? And the village and the travelers share this wonderful meal, right? And sort of, the great message of that story is that we build this experience together, and every pot of soup is going to be different. But we still need a fire, we still need a pot, we still need some stones. Right? We still need villagers and we still need the traveler, right? Like those characters are essential to the experience, and that's the value of outcomes to my mind. One final comment. I have developed outcomes for the university and in my other life. Many of us have other lives. And I have encountered these same discussions there. And where I've landed is, as I said in the video, that, outcomes are a melody, right? But it's my job to improvise off of those, right? And to write new songs where needed, right? And that the best outcomes are principle-based, not formal-based, right? It's important to talk about, the ability to think critically, right? Not to say you will read 5 essays. And there's one thing that we don't talk about in learning outcomes, but that the best outcomes don't interfere with how I design my actual class and how I deliver my class, right? There is room for inquiry. I'm teaching a course in philosophy, for example, and I've created an opportunity for dialogue in the classroom, and one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to actually hold an open conference at the beginning of the class, at the beginning of the course, and we are going to, as a group, define the conversations that we're going to have in those cafes to some extent. Right? So, for example, there is room in outcomes for inquiry in the Socratic method, which I think is very important.
Thank you very much, Michael. Tasha?
Can I take this out?
Yeah.
I'm just going to stand up.
I wish I could.
I really appreciate everything that everyone has said, and it actually has made me feel a little bit better about the way I feel about learning outcomes, because I just, as a background to my experience working in post-secondary, I've been teaching as a contract instructor since 2004. And I started teaching in Lethbridge College, which is a very conservative place. And I always just felt like, okay, well, no one actually knows what I'm doing, so I'll be okay here. So very much under the radar kind of thing. And like some of you have kind of brought up, that we were very compartmentalized in universities. So I just, most of my teaching experience has been kind of alone. And so the dominant narrative and the way that I think and the way that I am in the world is very different. And so I've come into that space thinking, well, I have to deal with this dominant narrative and fulfill my contractual obligations, but also I don't really believe in this. So it helps me to hear what you've all had to say. Thank you. I wanted to share the work that I do, which is in the area of vulnerability. And so in my research work and in my performance work, I actually do that as on purpose. I share vulnerability and an experience of vulnerability with an audience to see what will emerge from that space. So I'm going to tell you what I do in case you don't know. I do a project called the Human Body Project, which I've been doing for the last 8 years almost. And to work in the area of vulnerability, I show up naked and unscripted in performance and in public, which even just talking to you and saying that out loud to you is a very vulnerable experience for me. So then to actually do it is, it's difficult and challenging, but it's also incredibly enlightening. And I've learned so much through doing it, but I've also expanded so much my ideas about what teaching is through doing it. And I take that experience into my classrooms here. So to me, teaching is a sacred act. And I'm sharing my philosophy with you and kind of some of my background with you, because I feel like there's this tension. You brought up that word, and tension is, I feel like I live in that tension. So I'm a useful person in the sense of, oh, if you want to actually like learn about the tension, why don't you go find somebody that's actually living it all the time? And I feel like that gives me a lot of empathy for my students, and it doesn't take away from any learning outcomes I've discovered. It's like bigger than the learning outcomes. But I find my kind of, I'm not pro or con learning outcomes. My feeling about learning outcomes is they should be meaningful, they should be authentic. And to really approach, I think almost any class, even if it's rocket science, there has to be on some level, like a level of humility and this openness to creativity that others have mentioned. I didn't bring notes. I wrote a couple things down, but this is something that I have pinned on a bulletin board where my kids' art is up, because I sometimes try to remind my kids of this. And since it's by Albert Einstein, I figure, it fits in a university situation. The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. And I really believe that in vulnerability, there is so much opportunity to experience intuition and to experience that emergence of understanding and connection. And I know this from experiencing it, and also not just me, but by seeing how it affects people in my audiences. But it's a very difficult thing to explain and talk about. And even in the moment when people are, I've seen it over and over when I do the Human Body Project, where there's people that are just like, what? But in their moment of doing that and continuing to be in that, and in that moment of imperfect communication as well, I see learnings happening for them. I don't know how much they take out of it, or whether because so many people talk themselves out of what they've learned because it didn't fit in with their outcome. And I've seen students do that too, where they're like, in evaluations of how I teach, it's like, I think like they have done amazing work, and then they complain because, it wasn't like structured in the way that they thought it should have been structured. I teach a class here, media project in the BAPC program, where I give the students like a lot of time and space and to create what they need to create, because they're supposed to create basically 2 media projects. In a month, I'm supposed to teach them how to do that. They know what they are supposed to do. They already have so many ideas. They've taken a year of their BAPC program. So the gift to them is the time and space to be able to do it, and then I provide guidance. I mean, I teach other classes where it's more, let's do this textbook and we got to learn these readings and we got to talk about these readings. But the media project class is a great example of allowing what needs to emerge. And I've seen incredibly amazing work come out of my students, and I've also seen like complaints about the course when they've done, I think, really stellar material, like projects. Yeah, I didn't plan what I was going to say, and I feel really honored that you would let me share, so thank you.
Thank you all so much for sharing your profound insights with us.